Welcome back. You're now listening to the second part of our journey through the lives of the presidents of the United States. A bedtime story for grown-ups. If you've been with us from the beginning, thank you for continuing this quiet path through history. If you're just joining us now, feel free to relax and let the stories carry you. We'll continue one president at a time, with soft voices from the past drifting gently into sleep. Long before he was etched into stone at the Lincoln Memorial, long before his face appeared on coins or his speeches were memorized in classrooms, Abraham Lincoln was just a boy growing up on the edge of the American wilderness. He was born on a cold winter's morning, February 12th, in the year 1809, in a small log cabin in Hardin County. His parents, Thomas and Nancy, were poor farmers, and the land they lived on was rough, unforgiving, and remote. Life on the frontier was filled with hard work, meager comforts, and the ever-present threat of loss. And Lincoln knew loss early. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, leaving a scar on his heart that never fully healed. As a boy, Lincoln had little formal education, perhaps a year or two, all told. But he had a hunger for knowledge that burned quietly, steadily, like a lantern in the dark. He read whatever he could get his hands on: the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Shakespeare. Books were rare, but words became his companions, shaping the way he saw the world. He would write on scraps of wood, on slate, on the backs of envelopes, anything that held ink or chalk. He had a tall, awkward frame and a shy manner, and though he could split logs with the best of them, he often felt like an outsider, more comfortable thinking and observing than leading. As he grew, Lincoln's path meandered through several jobs: rail splitter, store clerk, postmaster, and eventually a self-taught lawyer. He moved to Illinois, where he began to make a name for himself, not only with his towering height — he stood 6'4" — but with his honesty, wit, and gift for storytelling. People remembered him for his deep, resonant voice and his ability to speak plainly, in ways that touched the hearts of ordinary folks. They called him Honest Abe, not just because he told the truth, but because he seemed to be the truth. No pretense, no arrogance, just a man trying to do what was right. Lincoln first entered politics in his 20s, serving in the Illinois state legislature and then, later, in the United States House of Representatives. But it wasn't until the 1850s that he stepped onto the national stage in a powerful way. The country was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, whether it should be allowed to expand into new territories, whether the federal government had the right to stop it, whether the nation could continue as half slave and half free. In 1858, Lincoln challenged a towering figure of the time, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, for his seat in the Senate. Though Lincoln lost the election, the debates between the two men, on fields, in town squares, before thousands, brought Lincoln's powerful moral voice into homes and hearts across America. He spoke of slavery not with hatred, but with sorrow. He believed it was wrong, incompatible with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, which said that all men were created equal. He worried about what slavery was doing not just to those who suffered under it, but to the soul of the nation. His words were not always welcomed. Many called him a radical. Some mocked his appearance, his accent, his frontier manners. But slowly the nation began to listen. In the year 1860, amid a storm of political tension, Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican candidate for president. And on a November night, he won, not with the support of the South, but with the voices of the North and the hope of those who still believed in union and freedom. He would take office in March of 1861, but the moment was already trembling with danger. Even before his inauguration, several Southern states had seceded from the Union. The road ahead would not be smooth. It would be lined with fire, blood, and heartbreak. But Lincoln, the quiet man from the frontier, the boy who read by firelight and mourned his mother in the woods of Kentucky, was ready to face the storm. As you close your eyes now, picture a small candlelit cabin in the wilderness. A young boy sits cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud to himself from a worn book. Snow drifts softly outside. A dog lies curled beside the fire. That boy would grow up to hold a broken nation in his hands, to speak the words that would redefine liberty, and to become one of the most beloved leaders in history, not because he was perfect, but because he understood struggle, sorrow, and the quiet strength of hope. Abraham Lincoln became president in March of 1861, at a time when the United States was already unraveling. 7 southern states had seceded from the Union even before he took office, and more would follow soon. The nation stood on the edge of civil war, and Lincoln knew that his words and actions in those early days would carry immense weight. He was calm and resolute. He believed that preserving the Union was the most important task before him, more than his own popularity, more than his party, more than his life. He hoped to avoid bloodshed, but he was also prepared for what lay ahead. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the Civil War began. Lincoln faced a challenge unlike any president before him. He led a divided country through the darkest conflict in its history. Every decision he made weighed heavily on him. He read letters from grieving mothers, from desperate soldiers, from former slaves hoping for freedom. Each night he carried those burdens home, often unable to sleep, pacing the halls of the White House or sitting alone in thought. He visited the wounded in hospitals, walked among the soldiers in their camps, listened to their stories, and remembered their faces. He knew their pain, and he knew the cost of every order he gave. Yet, through it all, he remained steadfast, believing that the Union must be preserved, not just as a collection of states, but as an idea, a promise that all people could be free and equal. His most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, delivered in November of 1863, was only a few minutes long, but changed how Americans saw their country. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. His words echoed far beyond the battlefield. Though the war dragged on and the toll was immense, Lincoln never gave up. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring that slaves in rebel states were free and giving the war a deeper moral purpose. It was a turning point. Though freedom would still be fought for in courts and streets for generations, Lincoln had lit the flame of change. His second inauguration in 1865 came as the war was nearing its end, and in that speech he spoke not with vengeance but with grace. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He said, "Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds and care for those who had borne the battle." Just weeks later, the war ended. But Lincoln would not live to see the peace he had longed for. On April 14, 1865, as he sat in Ford's Theater watching a play with his wife, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The next morning he died. The nation mourned like never before. People lined the train tracks as his body was carried home to Illinois, crying, praying, placing flowers on the rails as if to say thank you, goodbye, and rest in peace. Today, Lincoln stands as one of the greatest presidents in American history, not because he sought power, but because he carried it with humility. He taught us that leadership is about compassion, courage, and the willingness to hold a country together when everything threatens to pull it apart. As you drift to sleep now, imagine the quiet of the White House on a cold spring night. A tall, tired man sits at a desk by lamplight, writing words that will outlive him, listening to the wind, hoping that tomorrow will bring peace. Andrew Johnson became president in April of 1865, following the tragic assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, had been selected as Lincoln's vice president in part to unite the divided nation. But when Lincoln died, the immense task of healing the country fell to Johnson. He now had to oversee Reconstruction, the process of reintegrating the Southern states into the Union after the Civil War, a challenge that would test his leadership and bring him into direct conflict with Congress. Born in December of 1808 in Raleigh, North Carolina, Johnson had a life marked by hardship and poverty. He never received formal education, but his determination to improve himself was evident. After working as a tailor, Johnson entered politics, eventually becoming the mayor of Greenville, Tennessee, and later serving as the state's governor. His political career was built on a platform of supporting the common man, opposing the wealthy plantation aristocracy. However, his views on slavery were complicated. He was a staunch Unionist, but he also owned slaves early in his life. When the Civil War broke out, Johnson remained loyal to the Union. He was one of the few Southern politicians to refuse to secede with his state. In 1862, President Lincoln appointed him as military governor of Tennessee, where he worked to restore Union control. His commitment to the Union helped secure his place as Lincoln's running mate in the election of 1864. Johnson was viewed as a man who could bridge the gap between the North and South, someone who understood both sides of the conflict. However, once he became president, Johnson's approach to Reconstruction differed sharply from that of Congress. While Congress, particularly the radical Republicans, advocated for a harsher Reconstruction plan that would protect the rights of freed slaves and ensure lasting change in the South, Johnson favored a more lenient approach. He believed the Southern states had never legally seceded and should be quickly restored to the Union with minimal conditions. His stance angered many in Congress, especially when Johnson issued pardons to former Confederate leaders, allowing them to regain political power. As tensions between Johnson and Congress grew, they reached a breaking point in 1867. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which restricted Johnson's ability to remove certain office holders without Senate approval. In response, Johnson attempted to remove Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, in violation of the act. This led to his impeachment. The trial took place in the Senate, and in May of 1868, Johnson was acquitted by a single vote. Although he remained in office, his political influence was severely diminished. Despite the turmoil of his presidency, Johnson played a crucial role in the early years of Reconstruction. He supported the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but he was less supportive of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which aimed to grant African Americans equal rights. Johnson's presidency ended in 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant succeeded him. Andrew Johnson's presidency continued to be marked by conflict and struggle, especially as the nation grappled with the aftermath of the Civil War and the question of how to rebuild the South. In his second year in office, Johnson's leniency toward the former Confederate states was increasingly at odds with the more radical members of Congress, especially the radical Republicans, who felt that Johnson was not doing enough to protect the newly freed African American population. They wanted to ensure that the Southern states would undergo a thorough transformation, one that would guarantee the rights and freedom of formerly enslaved people. But Johnson, born in the South and having lived through the bitter experience of the Civil War, felt that the Southern states should be treated with more leniency. His plan for Reconstruction involved the quick restoration of Southern states to the Union, with minimal punishment for former Confederates. He believed that the quicker the states were reintegrated, the sooner the nation could begin to heal. But his approach was not widely supported. Many Southern states passed black codes, laws that severely restricted the rights of African Americans, effectively keeping them in a state of subjugation. Johnson's unwillingness to challenge these laws angered Congress. and by the summer of 1866, tensions had reached a boiling point. In an effort to counter Johnson's policies, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which aimed to protect the rights of African Americans by granting them citizenship and guaranteeing equal protection under the law. Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode his veto, marking the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on such a major piece of legislation. This was just the beginning of the struggle between Johnson and Congress. In the same year, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and provided them with equal protection under the law. Johnson, however, opposed the amendment, and once again his opposition put him at odds with Congress. By this time, his political power was waning, and his position became more precarious with each passing day. The tipping point came in 1867, when Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into military districts and placed them under martial law. The laws also required Southern states to draft new constitutions that would grant voting rights to African American men. Johnson, still determined to maintain his approach to Reconstruction, clashed with Congress once more. When he attempted to remove Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, who was a supporter of the Radical Republicans, he violated the Tenure of Office Act, which restricted the president's ability to remove certain officials without Senate approval. This led to his impeachment in February of 1868. The impeachment trial was a highly charged event, with the nation divided over whether Johnson's actions warranted removal from office. Johnson's defense argued that he had been acting within his constitutional rights, while his opponents believed he was obstructing the necessary reforms for the nation's recovery. After a month of heated debate, the Senate voted to acquit Johnson by a single vote, preventing his removal from office. Though he was not removed, the acquittal did not restore his political power. By the time his term ended in 1869, Johnson had little influence left in Washington. Though his presidency was marred by conflict and controversy, Andrew Johnson's role in Reconstruction was a crucial chapter in the nation's history. His lenient policies and clashes with Congress delayed many of the changes that were needed to secure equality for African Americans. Nevertheless, Johnson's presidency was a reflection of the deep divisions that existed in the nation during a time of immense change. As you lay down to rest, imagine the tension of those times. Johnson in the White House, surrounded by conflicting advice, as the country teetered on the brink of change. His decisions were shaped by the turmoil of the era, and his legacy remains a reminder of the challenges of leadership during such a fractured time. Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, assumed office in March of 1869 after the contentious presidency of Andrew Johnson. Grant, born on April 27, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio, had risen to national prominence as a brilliant and determined general during the Civil War. His military successes were legendary, culminating in his role as the Union's general-in-chief, where his relentless strategy and leadership led to the defeat of the Confederacy. Grant's rise to fame began in earnest in the early days of the Civil War. After struggling in civilian life, working in various positions, including as a clerk and even dealing with personal setbacks, Grant returned to the military in 1861 when the war broke out. He quickly proved himself a capable officer, winning key battles such as the Battle of Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh. His ability to press on despite heavy losses and his insistence on never letting up in pursuit of victory earned him respect from both his soldiers and his superiors. In 1864, President Lincoln promoted Grant to the position of General-in-Chief of all Union armies. From this vantage point, Grant adopted a strategy of constant pressure on the Confederate forces. His strategy was simple yet brutal. The Union would continue fighting on all fronts, wearing down the South until its forces could no longer hold up. The key to this approach was not seeking decisive battles that could turn the tide overnight, but instead making the war a war of attrition, one the South could not sustain. This strategy was successful, and in April of 1865, Grant accepted the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. Grant's military career had made him a national hero, and many believed he could translate his battlefield success into a successful president. In 1868, as the nation was still reeling from the effects of Reconstruction and the aftermath of the war, Grant ran for president as the Republican candidate, with his campaign centered on restoring national unity and ensuring the protection of civil rights for freed slaves. His popularity as a war hero played a significant role in his election, and when he took office in March of 1869, Grant was seen as a man who could heal the wounds of the nation. However, Grant's presidency would not be without its struggles. The challenges he faced were many, and they came not from the battlefield but from within the halls of government. One of his first tasks was to manage the continuing process of Reconstruction in the South. Grant supported the protection of African American civil rights and worked to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. His administration took steps to combat the Ku Klux Klan, which had been terrorizing black communities in the South, and passed the Enforcement Acts, which gave the federal government the power to intervene and protect the rights of African Americans. Yet, while Grant's commitment to Reconstruction and civil rights was clear, his presidency was also marred by corruption scandals. Several of his closest associates and members of his administration were implicated in scandals, most notably the Crédit Mobilier scandal and the Whiskey Ring scandal. These issues caused significant damage to Grant's reputation and gave his political opponents ammunition to attack his administration. Despite these scandals, Grant remained popular among many Americans, especially in the North, due to his commitment to Reconstruction and his steadfast belief in protecting the rights of African Americans. Ulysses S. Grant's second term, which began in March of 1873, was a continuation of the challenges that had marked his first. While Grant had been widely celebrated for his military triumphs, his time as president revealed a more complicated and often controversial side of his leadership. In his second term, Grant continued to face the same issues that had haunted his first, particularly the issue of Reconstruction and the protection of African American rights in the South. Although Grant had passed important legislation during his first term to safeguard the civil rights of freedmen, including the Enforcement Acts that sought to curb the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, the progress in the South remained slow and uneven. The Reconstruction period was coming to an end, and with it the federal government's commitment to protecting African American rights began to wane. As Northern interest in Reconstruction declined, Southern states began to pass laws that disenfranchised African Americans and reimposed segregation in many forms. Despite the challenges, Grant was unwavering in his support for civil rights. He continued to send federal troops to the South to protect African American voters and to ensure that the 15th Amendment, which prohibited voting discrimination based on race, was in force. In 1875, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed equal access to public accommodations for African Americans. However, this law would later be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883, leaving African Americans vulnerable to the racist policies that would dominate the South for decades. Grant's second term was also overshadowed by a series of scandals, the most infamous being the Whiskey Ring. This scandal involved government officials, distillers, and tax collectors who were involved in a scheme to embezzle millions of dollars in liquor taxes. Although Grant himself was not directly implicated, the scandal tarnished his administration and damaged his reputation. His inability to control the corruption that was rampant within his administration led to a loss of public confidence, and many began to question his leadership. Despite these problems, Grant remained resolute in his determination to continue his policies. He also faced significant economic challenges. The nation entered a severe economic depression in 1873, which lasted for several years and led to widespread unemployment and business failures. The Panic of 1873 was triggered by the collapse of the railroad industry, which had been overexpanded, leading to a collapse of several banks and a wave of bankruptcies. Grant's efforts to stabilize the economy included the adoption of the gold standard, which was intended to create a more stable currency system. However, this policy was deeply unpopular among many, especially farmers and those in debt, who felt that it benefited wealthy industrialists while hurting the working class. In foreign policy, Grant was more successful. He worked to expand American influence abroad, particularly in Latin America and Asia. He negotiated a treaty with Great Britain to resolve the issue of the Alabama Claims, a dispute over British support for the Confederate Navy during the Civil War. The treaty resulted in Great Britain agreeing to pay the United States a large sum in damages. Grant also worked to establish closer ties with Latin American nations, seeking to expand trade and influence in the region. By the end of Grant's second term, the nation was deeply divided, both politically and economically. The scandals that marred his presidency and the economic difficulties that had plagued his second term contributed to his decision not to seek a third term in office, despite pressure from some of his supporters to run again. Grant left office in 1877, his presidency having been one of both great achievement and significant controversy. After leaving the White House, Grant retired from politics and spent time writing his memoirs, which would become a literary masterpiece and a crucial historical document. His personal account of the Civil War was praised for its honesty and its insight into his military strategy. He died on July 23, 1885, at the age of 63, after a prolonged battle with throat cancer. As you settle into sleep, think of Grant, once a simple man from Ohio, transformed by the fires of war into a national hero and then a president who faced the difficult task of leading a divided nation through a period of reconstruction and recovery. His legacy, filled with both triumph and scandal, reminds us that even the most heroic figures are shaped by the complex forces of their time. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, assumed office in March of 1877 at the tail end of the turbulent Reconstruction period. Born on October 4, 1822 in Delaware, Ohio, Hayes had spent much of his life as a lawyer and soldier before entering politics. His career, though marked by personal integrity, would be defined by a contested election and a presidency that aimed to heal the nation after the scars of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Hayes began his journey toward the White House as a quiet but effective figure in Ohio politics. He served as a congressman and then as governor of Ohio, where he gained a reputation for his honesty and dedication to reform. When the Civil War broke out, Hayes, despite being a relatively young man at the time, enlisted as a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army. He served with distinction, rising to the rank of brevet major general. He was wounded several times during the war, an experience that cemented his status as a man of personal courage and conviction. After the war, Hayes returned to Ohio, where he entered politics. His governance of Ohio was noted for efforts to reform state institutions and promote education. As a Republican, he was elected as the governor of Ohio 3 times. and his leadership style was characterized by a strong sense of moral responsibility. He was especially known for opposing corruption within the political system, even when it meant standing against his own party. Hayes was a proponent of civil service reform, advocating for the end of the spoils system, where political supporters were rewarded with government jobs regardless of their qualification. In 1876, Hayes found himself thrust into the national spotlight. The presidential election of that year was one of the most contentious in American history. Hayes ran as the Republican candidate against Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic nominee. The election was marked by widespread voter fraud and disputed results, especially in the southern states. Both candidates claimed victory, and the nation was on the verge of a constitutional crisis. After weeks of uncertainty and political maneuvering, a special electoral commission was established to resolve the dispute. In an outcome that shocked many, the commission awarded the contested electoral votes to Hayes, making him the winner of the election by a margin of just one electoral vote. Tilden won the popular vote by a significant margin, and many Democrats were outraged by the outcome, leading to the infamous Compromise of 1877. As part of the compromise, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively bringing an end to Reconstruction. In return, Southern Democrats agreed to accept Hayes's presidency and allow him to take office. This marked the end of the federal government's efforts to protect the civil rights of African Americans in the South, and it would lead to the rise of Jim Crow laws and widespread segregation that would last for decades. Once in office, Hayes worked to restore the nation's confidence in its leadership, which had been severely shaken by the election controversy. He focused on civil service reform, believing that government jobs should be awarded based on merit rather than political connections. His administration saw the establishment of the first federal civil service exams, a significant step toward a more professional and less corrupt government. Hayes also made significant efforts to improve the economy. His administration focused on reducing the national debt and stabilizing the currency, which had been subject to wild fluctuations in the post-Civil War years. His economic policies were generally conservative, and he sought to bring about financial stability without resorting to radical measures. In foreign policy, Hayes took a relatively cautious approach. He focused on building peaceful relations with other countries and avoiding military entanglements. One of his significant achievements was the peaceful settlement of the border dispute between the United States and Canada over the region of the San Juan Islands. Hayes also supported the opening of trade relations with China, promoting American business interests in Asia. Despite his accomplishments, Hayes was a president whose tenure was often overshadowed by the controversies surrounding his election and the end of Reconstruction. His decision to withdraw federal troops from the South has been widely criticized in hindsight, as it allowed white supremacist groups to regain control of southern states and enforce discriminatory laws. However, Hayes's focus on civil service reform and his desire to restore honesty to government are seen as lasting legacies of his presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes's second year in office saw the continuation of his efforts to navigate the complex landscape left by the Civil War and Reconstruction. His decision to withdraw federal troops from the South, made as part of the Compromise of 1877, proved to be both a turning point in his presidency and a defining moment for the nation. It marked the formal end of Reconstruction and the beginning of what many historians have called the Southern Redemption, where white Southern Democrats regained control over the region, effectively reversing the progress made during the Reconstruction era in terms of African American civil rights. Though Hayes had hoped that his withdrawal of troops would lead to national reconciliation, the immediate result was far more troubling. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans for generations. The withdrawal of federal oversight allowed white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan to resurface, further oppressing African Americans. Hayes's decision remains one of the most contentious aspects of his presidency, as it signaled the federal government's retreat from its responsibility to protect the civil rights of freedmen. Despite the disappointment of Reconstruction's collapse, Hayes worked tirelessly to address other areas of reform and progress. His commitment to civil service reform remained one of the cornerstones of his presidency. Long before he was etched into stone at the Lincoln Memorial, long before his face appeared on coins or his speeches were memorized in classrooms, Abraham Lincoln was just a boy growing up on the edge of the American wilderness. He was born on a cold winter's morning, February 12th, in the year 1809, in a small log cabin in Hardin County. His parents, Thomas and Nancy, were poor farmers, and the land they lived on was rough, unforgiving, and remote. Life on the frontier was filled with hard work, meager comforts, and the ever-present threat of loss. And Lincoln knew loss early. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, leaving a scar on his heart that never fully healed. As a boy, Lincoln had little formal education, perhaps a year or two, all told. But he had a hunger for knowledge that burned quietly, steadily, like a lantern in the dark. He read whatever he could get his hands on: the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Shakespeare. Books were rare, but words became his companions, shaping the way he saw the world. He would write on scraps of wood, on slate, on the backs of envelopes, anything that held ink or chalk. In one notable incident, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 broke out, initially in response to wage cuts by the railroad companies. The strike spread across several states, disrupting transportation and leading to violent clashes between workers and the National Guard. Hayes, faced with the unrest, responded with force, sending federal troops to break the strike and restore order. While his actions were aimed at maintaining peace and order, they were deeply controversial. Many saw his decision as siding with the powerful railroad corporations at the expense of the workers, and it further deepened the divide between labor and the government. In foreign affairs, Hayes worked to maintain America's diplomatic and commercial interests without becoming embroiled in international conflicts. One of his key successes in this area was his handling of the U.S.-Chile dispute in 1880, when a group of American sailors was attacked in Valparaiso, Chile. Hayes quickly responded with diplomatic pressure, leading to an agreement that avoided war and demonstrated the United States' ability to defend its citizens abroad. Hayes also supported the creation of the modern American diplomatic system, strengthening the U.S. presence in Latin America through initiatives such as the establishment of the Inter-American Conference. This laid the foundation for future American foreign policy in the region and helped cement the notion of the United States as a rising global power. Domestically, Hayes's administration continued to face economic challenges, although the worst effects of the post-Civil War economic depression had begun to subside by the end of his second year in office. Hayes believed in sound money policies, and he remained committed to reducing the national debt. He advocated for the resumption of specie payments, the exchange of paper money for gold, to restore stability to the U.S. currency. In 1879, the United States returned to the gold standard, a critical move for the nation's economic recovery. Despite the progress he made in civil service reform, labor relations, and foreign policy, Hayes's presidency remained overshadowed by the end of Reconstruction and the challenges it brought to the African American community. His term was marked by a mixture of hope and disappointment, as his desire for national healing clashed with the harsh realities of racial discrimination and economic inequality. Rutherford B. Hayes chose not to seek a second term in 1880, honoring a pledge he had made during his first campaign to serve only one term. He left office on March 4, 1880, and returned to Ohio, where he continued to be an advocate for education and reform. After his presidency, Hayes's reputation grew, particularly for his role in advocating for civil service reform. He remained an active public figure, promoting progressive causes, and he became a vocal critic of the injustices that had followed the end of Reconstruction. Hayes died on January 17, 1893, at the age of 70. Though his presidency was marked by significant challenges, his legacy as a reformer and a man of principle would ultimately be remembered fondly by historians. As you drift into sleep tonight, think of Rutherford B. Hayes, a president who worked tirelessly for integrity and reform during a time of national division. His legacy reminds us that leadership often requires difficult decisions, but it also teaches us the importance of standing firm in one's principles, even when the path forward is unclear. James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, entered office in March of 1881 with great promise, but his presidency would be tragically cut short. Born on November 19, 1831 in a log cabin in Moreland Hills, Ohio, Garfield's early life was a humble one. He grew up in poverty, losing his father when he was just a young child. Despite the hardships, Garfield's innate intelligence and determination propelled him forward. He worked his way through school, eventually attending Williams College in Massachusetts, where he proved himself to be a brilliant student. Garfield's early adult life was marked by his service in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry and quickly rose through the ranks due to his leadership ability. He fought in several key battles, including the Battle of Chickamauga, where he was promoted to the rank of Major General. Despite facing danger on the battlefield, Garfield's intellect and strategic thinking stood out, and he became one of the war's most respected commanders. After the war, Garfield turned to politics, where he quickly made a name for himself. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1863, and over the years he became known for his strong speeches and advocacy for a range of issues, from education to civil rights. Garfield was a member of the Republican Party and stood out as a supporter of Reconstruction and the rights of African Americans. He believed deeply in the nation's potential for growth and progress and worked diligently to shape legislation that would help build a more unified, stronger America. In 1880, Garfield was elected as the U.S. Senator from Ohio, but his political career took an unexpected turn when he was nominated for president by the Republican Party. The election of 1880 was a tense and bitter one, with the country still grappling with the aftermath of Reconstruction and economic instability. Garfield's victory was by no means assured. He faced strong opposition from fellow Republicans who were divided between the stalwart faction, led by Senator Roscoe Conkling, and the half-breed faction, which Garfield supported. Despite the bitter Republican infighting, Garfield ultimately won the presidency in one of the closest elections in American history. He was elected by the Electoral College, but his victory was a narrow one, and it reflected the deep divisions within the nation. Garfield's ascent to the White House was not just a personal triumph, but also a symbol of the ongoing struggle between competing political ideologies and interests within the Republican Party. Garfield's presidency, however, was tragically short-lived. Just a few months into his term, on July 2, 1881, he was shot by Charles J. Guiteau, a disgruntled office seeker who was angry at not receiving a patronage job. Guiteau approached Garfield at a train station in Washington, D.C., and shot him twice, one bullet grazing his arm and the other lodging in his back. The shooting sent shock waves through the nation, and Garfield's suffering would become a painful symbol of the dangers of political factionalism and the spoils system. Garfield was rushed to the White House, where doctors attempted to save his life, but their treatments were rudimentary and their methods were flawed. The lack of proper medical knowledge, particularly regarding infections and sanitation, led to complications. Garfield's condition worsened over the course of the next several weeks, as infections set in from the unsanitary conditions surrounding his treatment. Despite the best efforts of his doctors, Garfield passed away on September 19, 1881, just over 2 months after the shooting. The death of James A. Garfield shocked the nation and brought attention to the dangers of political patronage and the lack of reform in the government. The assassination of Garfield, along with the subsequent outcry over his death, helped to push forward the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, a law that sought to end the practice of appointing government positions based on political favoritism. The law, passed in 1883, established the foundation for a merit-based civil service system in the United States. Garfield's death also raised important questions about the health and treatment of presidents, particularly when it came to the quality of medical care they received. Garfield's doctors were criticized for their ineffective treatments, which included attempts to probe his wound with unsterilized instruments. His death highlighted the need for medical reforms, especially in the realm of infection control. Though Garfield's time in office was brief, his presidency has been remembered for the promise it held. He was a man of great intellect, integrity, and vision, and his leadership could have shaped the future of the nation in profound ways had he been given more time. His tragic assassination brought about lasting reforms in both political and medical practices, making his legacy one of both profound loss and lasting change. James A. Garfield, though his life was tragically cut short, remains a figure whose legacy endured in the reforms that followed his untimely death. His story is one of promise and tragedy, but also of the changes that were set in motion because of his passing. Garfield's assassination spurred a deep reflection within the country, not just on the immediate loss of a president, but also on the systems that allowed for such a tragedy to occur. Born into poverty, Garfield's path to the presidency was marked by hard work, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to his beliefs. As a young man, Garfield's academic abilities set him apart. He was a voracious reader, deeply interested in history, literature, and philosophy. He believed that education could change the world, a conviction that would shape much of his later political career. His early experiences in the Ohio State Legislature and later in the U.S. House of Representatives were marked by a strong sense of duty and an eagerness to tackle the pressing issues of the day. One of Garfield's early focuses was on the question of civil rights, particularly for African Americans. As a member of the Republican Party, he stood firm in his commitment to Reconstruction and the protection of the rights of freedmen. He was an advocate for the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote, and worked towards creating a more equitable society in the post-Civil War United States. Garfield was also deeply invested in promoting education and public welfare, believing that a well-educated citizenry was the foundation for a prosperous and just society. Garfield's rise to political prominence was largely due to his reputation as a reformer and a moderate voice in the Republican Party. He worked to bridge the gap between the factions that had divided the party, particularly the stalwarts, who were aligned with the patronage system, and the half-breeds, who sought civil service reform. It was this ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the time that made Garfield a strong candidate for president in 1880. When Garfield assumed the presidency, his agenda was one of reform and progress. He was determined to reduce the power of the political machines that had long controlled much of the American political system. His presidency was marked by a commitment to ending the spoils system, which had allowed politicians to reward loyal supporters with government positions regardless of their qualifications. Garfield's vision for the country was one of merit-based appointments, where public service would be based on ability, not political favoritism. However, Garfield's political reforms would be cut short by the actions of Charles J. Guiteau, the man who assassinated him. Guido, who had been denied a patronage job by Garfield's administration, believed that he had played a key role in Garfield's election and felt entitled to a position in the government. When his request was denied, he took matters into his own hands and shot Garfield. The country was stunned by the act, and the tragedy deepened as Garfield fought for his life over the following weeks. As Garfield lay in the White House, his condition worsened. The doctors who attended to him were unable to stem the tide of infection that began to spread throughout his body. The medical care of the time was primitive by modern standards, and Garfield's physicians were criticized for their use of unsterilized instruments and their lack of understanding of the importance of sanitation in preventing infection. Garfield's slow, painful death served as a sobering reminder of the limitations of medical knowledge in the late 19th century. Despite the efforts of his doctors, Garfield passed away on September 19, 1881, leaving behind a nation in mourning. His death, however, was not in vain. It served as a catalyst for much-needed reforms, particularly in the area of civil service. Garfield's assassination exposed the corruption and inefficiency of the political patronage system, and in the years that followed, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was passed in 1883. The law aimed to eliminate the spoils system and establish a merit-based civil service, a significant shift that would shape the future of American politics. Garfield's brief presidency also highlighted the need for medical reform. The public outcry over the ineffectiveness of his treatment led to greater awareness of the importance of sanitation in medical practices. The tragedy of Garfield's death would contribute to the growing movement to improve medical care, particularly in terms of infection control and hygiene. His death, while deeply sorrowful, served as a turning point in the history of both American politics and medicine. Though Garfield's time in office was short, his impact was lasting. His commitment to reform, his dedication to public service, and his tragic death all left a mark on the nation. James A. Garfield may not have had the chance to fully implement his vision for the United States, but his legacy lives on in the reforms that were enacted in the years following his death. He is remembered as a man of intellect, integrity, and purpose, a president who, had he lived longer, might have been able to steer the country in a new direction of progress and reform. As you close your eyes tonight, think of James A. Garfield, a president who lived with purpose and whose death, though tragic, helped shape the future of the nation. His life is a reminder that even the briefest of presidencies can leave an enduring impact, and that the quest for justice, fairness, and progress is a timeless pursuit. In the quiet early hours of September 19, 1881, the weight of the presidency fell unexpectedly on the shoulders of Chester Alan Arthur. Just hours earlier, the nation had lost President James A. Garfield to an assassin's bullet and months of painful suffering. And now, Chester Arthur, a man many had viewed as a product of political patronage and backroom deals, was the new President of the United States. Few expected much from him, some even feared the worst. But what happened next would surprise nearly everyone, because Chester Arthur, the political insider with a reputation for favoring the spoils system, would become one of the most reform-minded presidents of the 19th century. Chester Arthur was born on October 5, 1829, in Fairfield, Vermont, the fifth of 9 children. His father, a Baptist preacher from Ireland, moved the family frequently through Vermont and upstate New York. As a boy, Arthur learned the value of education and hard work. He attended Union College in Schenectady, New York, where he excelled in debate and began developing the charm and sophistication that would one day carry him to the highest office in the land. After college, he studied law and soon began practicing in New York City. His career took a sharp turn during the Civil War. Though Arthur never saw combat, He served as Quartermaster General of the New York Militia, responsible for organizing supplies and logistics for Union troops. It was during these years that he built strong political connections, especially with Roscoe Conkling, a powerful U.S. senator and leader of the Republican Party's stalwart faction. The stalwarts were defenders of the spoils system, a practice where political supporters were rewarded with government jobs. And Arthur, as collector of the Port of New York, one of the most lucrative federal appointments in the country, became a key figure in that world. As collector, Arthur earned a reputation for being both efficient and generous to party loyalists. He lived lavishly, dressed impeccably, and attended all the right social functions. To reformers, he was the very symbol of the corruption they hoped to eliminate. So, when James Garfield, who opposed the stalwarts, selected Arthur as his running mate in 1880, many saw it as a political compromise, not a choice of merit. When Arthur became vice president, he had little power or influence, serving mostly as a figurehead while Garfield struggled to unify a divided Republican Party. But when Garfield was assassinated, the country faced a moment of real uncertainty. Chester Arthur, the polished machine politician, was now president. Reformers were worried. Newspapers openly questioned whether he had the moral compass or courage to lead. But Arthur, deeply affected by Garfield's death and the national grief that followed, began to reflect. Something within him changed. No longer content to be merely a party man, he began to see the office of the presidency as a chance to rise above his past and do what was right for the country. One of Arthur's most significant acts came in the form of civil service reform. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, passed in 1883, was a direct result of his efforts. It established that government jobs should be awarded based on merit rather than political connections. It created competitive exams and protections against being fired for political reasons. Though the act only covered a small portion of federal jobs at first, it set the stage for a broader transformation of government hiring and marked a sharp break from the spoils system Arthur had once championed. Chester Arthur also worked to modernize the U.S. Navy, which had fallen into decline since the Civil War. Under his leadership, the Navy began building new steel ships, setting the course for the United States to become a modern naval power. He also vetoed a Chinese Exclusion Act that was too harsh, though a revised version later passed over his objections. An early indication of how complicated and sensitive immigration policy had already become in American politics. Throughout his presidency, Arthur surprised his critics. He carried himself with dignity, worked long hours, and distanced himself from his former political allies when necessary. He redecorated the White House, brought elegance back to state dinners, and was often seen walking alone in the early morning hours, thinking deeply about the responsibilities he carried. When the Republican Party considered him for another term, Arthur did not campaign actively, in part because he was secretly battling Bright's disease, a serious kidney condition that left him weak and in pain. Chester A. Arthur left the presidency in March of 1885. He returned to private life in New York, but would not live long after. He died on November 18, 1886, just 57 years old. Though his time as president was relatively brief, and though he never sought the office he inherited, Arthur had transformed his image, and more importantly, he had helped transform the country. He proved that people can change, that leadership is about rising to the moment, and that even the most unlikely leaders can leave behind a legacy of courage and reform. When Grover Cleveland returned to the White House in 1893, he made history as the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. The country had changed since his first administration, and so had the challenges. A severe economic depression struck almost immediately, triggered by the Panic of 1893. Banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, millions lost their jobs, bread lines stretched through city streets, and once again, Cleveland found himself in the center of a storm, this time one far more intense than the last. True to form, Cleveland refused to compromise his principles. He believed that sound money, not inflationary schemes, was the key to economic recovery. When many in his own party demanded the unlimited coinage of silver to expand the money supply, he stood firm in defense of the gold standard, even though it fractured his political base. It cost him popularity, allies, and the support of the Democratic Party's rising progressive wing. But Cleveland never measured his choices by their popularity. To him, leadership meant doing what was right, even if it meant standing alone. Labor unrest also defined his second term. When the Pullman strike paralyzed rail traffic and threatened to cripple the economy, Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike, despite fierce opposition from labor leaders and even some governors. He insisted it was his duty to ensure the mail was delivered and federal laws were upheld. It was a controversial decision, and one that earned him sharp criticism from organized labor. But Cleveland believed that maintaining order and upholding the Constitution came above political consequences. He also faced opposition in foreign affairs. In Hawaii, American business interests had overthrown the native monarchy, and there was pressure to annex the islands. But Cleveland, believing the coup to be unjust, withdrew the annexation treaty and called for the restoration of Queen Liliuokalani. It was a rare moment of restraint in a time of expanding American power, and a testament to Cleveland's belief that might did not make right. By the time his second term ended in 1897, Cleveland was exhausted and politically isolated. He left office unpopular, his party divided, and his policies under fire. Yet he never wavered. He had not sought applause. He had sought to preserve the principles he believed made the country strong: honesty, responsibility, and restraint. Grover Cleveland died in 1908 in his home in Princeton, New Jersey. His final words were said to be simple and dignified, just like the man himself. "I have tried so hard to do right." And in those words lies the story of his life. Not a tale of glory or political triumph, but of character, conviction, and an unshakable belief that public service should be guided by principle, not by popularity. His presidency reminds us that doing the right thing is not always the easy path, but it is often the most lasting one. In the bustling and often corrupt world of late 19th century American politics, one man rose to prominence not by playing the usual political games, but by doing the opposite, by standing firm for honesty, accountability, and simplicity. That man was Grover Cleveland, the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, making him both the 22nd and 24th President of the United States. His story begins not with a thirst for power, but with a deep-rooted belief in doing what was right, even when it was unpopular. Grover Cleveland's rise to the presidency was as unlikely as it was inspiring, and it offers a glimpse into the power of integrity in a time when politics was anything but pure. Stephen Grover Cleveland was born on March 18, 1837, in Caldwell, New Jersey. He was the 5th of 9 children in a deeply religious family. His father, a Presbyterian minister, died when Grover was just a teenager, forcing him to leave school and begin working to support his family. He worked first as a clerk and later as a teacher, eventually studying law while supporting himself. He was admitted to the bar in 1859, and over time he built a reputation as a serious, fair, and diligent lawyer. Cleveland moved to Buffalo, New York, where he became known for his dedication and honesty. His political career began modestly, first as assistant district attorney, then sheriff of Erie County. As sheriff, he personally carried out executions rather than delegating the task, believing it was his legal duty. He was a man of principle, if not always of charm. He wasn't particularly eloquent or flashy, but people trusted him. That trust propelled him into the role of mayor of Buffalo in 1881, where he gained national attention for battling corruption and vetoing wasteful spending. Within a year, he was elected governor of New York, where he continued his crusade for honest government. By 1884, the Democratic Party was desperate for a reform-minded candidate to counter the widespread scandals that had plagued Republican administrations. They turned to Cleveland, whose clean reputation offered hope in a jaded political climate. His Republican opponent, James G. Blaine, was heavily associated with corruption, and the contrast between the two candidates could not have been sharper. The campaign was bitter, with both sides slinging personal attacks. Cleveland's opponents revealed he had fathered a child out of wedlock years earlier, a revelation he admitted to with characteristic directness. "Tell the truth," he advised his campaign staff, "and the people will understand." That honesty resonated with voters, and Cleveland narrowly won the presidency in 1884, becoming the first Democrat elected to the office since before the Civil War. As president, Grover Cleveland brought a refreshing seriousness to the White House. He believed government should serve the people, not politicians, not party machines. He vetoed more bills than any president before him, often rejecting laws he believed were unconstitutional or wasteful, even when they were popular. One famous example came in 1887 when he vetoed a bill that would have provided aid to drought-stricken Texas farmers, arguing that while the cause was noble, the federal government had no authority to provide such aid, and private charity should handle it. It was a deeply unpopular stance, but one that reflected Cleveland's firm beliefs about limited government. Cleveland also fought hard against patronage and the spoils system. He pushed for civil service reform, expanded the number of federal jobs protected from political influence, and clashed with Congress over tariffs and the growing power of special interests. His battles earned him respect from reformers and resentment from party insiders. He married Frances Folsom in the White House in 1886. She was just 21, more than 27 years his junior, and remains the youngest First Lady in American history. The public was enchanted by the match, and Frances quickly became a beloved figure across the country. Despite his efforts, Cleveland's first term ended with rising dissatisfaction from within his own party. His principled stances on tariff reform and limited government alienated many Democrats, and in 1888 he lost re-election to Benjamin Harrison, even though he won the popular vote. He returned to private life in New York City, but he remained active and watchful of national politics. As Harrison's administration became bogged down in spending and economic trouble, many Americans began to long for the steady, honest leadership of Grover Cleveland. And so, in 1892, just 4 years after his defeat, Cleveland ran again, and this time he won, becoming the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But that chapter of his story, filled with economic depression, labor unrest, and hard decisions, would come later. When Grover Cleveland returned to the White House in 1893, he made history as the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. The country had changed since his first administration, and so had the challenges. A severe economic depression struck almost immediately, triggered by the panic of 1893. Banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, millions lost their jobs, bread lines stretched through city streets, and once again Cleveland found himself in the center of a storm, this time one far more intense than the last. True to form, Cleveland refused to compromise his principles. He believed that sound money, not inflationary schemes, was the key to economic recovery. When many in his own party demanded the unlimited coinage of silver to expand the money supply, he stood firm in defense of the gold standard, even though it fractured his political base. It cost him popularity, allies, and the support of the Democratic Party's rising progressive wing, but Cleveland never measured his choices by their popularity. To him, leadership meant doing what was right, even if it meant standing alone. Labor unrest also defined his second term. When the Pullman strike paralyzed rail traffic and threatened to cripple the economy, Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike. Despite fierce opposition from labor leaders and even some governors, he insisted it was his duty to ensure the mail was delivered and federal laws were upheld. It was a controversial decision and one that earned him sharp criticism from organized labor. But Cleveland believed that maintaining order and upholding the Constitution came above political consequences. He also faced opposition in foreign affairs. In Hawaii, American business interests had overthrown the native monarchy, and there was pressure to annex the islands. But Cleveland, believing the coup to be unjust, withdrew the annexation treaty and called for the restoration of Queen Leleokalani. It was a rare moment of restraint in a time of expanding American power, and a testament to Cleveland's belief that might did not make right. By the time his second term ended in 1897, Cleveland was exhausted and politically isolated. He left office unpopular, his party divided, and his policies under fire. Yet he never wavered. He had not sought applause. He had sought to preserve the principles he believed made the country strong: honesty, responsibility, and restraint. Grover Cleveland died in 1908 in his home in Princeton, New Jersey. His final words were said to be simple and dignified, just like the man himself. "I have tried so hard to do right." And in those words lies the story of his life. Not a tale of glory or political triumph, but of character, conviction, and an unshakable belief that public service should be guided by principle, not by popularity. His presidency reminds us that doing the right thing is not always the easy path, but it is often the most lasting one. In the years between Grover Cleveland's two terms, a new face stepped into the White House, one with a famous name and a thoughtful demeanor. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 9th President. Though he bore the legacy of a political family, Benjamin was known less for charisma and more for his quiet intelligence, sharp legal mind, and deep sense of duty. He was born in 1833 on a farm in Ohio, raised in a home steeped in civic values and public service. As a young man, he studied law and served with distinction in the Civil War, rising to the rank of brigadier general. He returned to civilian life as a successful lawyer in Indiana, eventually entering politics, where his eloquence and seriousness stood out. Harrison won the presidency in the election of 1888, despite losing the popular vote to Grover Cleveland. It was the Electoral College that gave him the victory, making his presidency controversial before it had even begun. But once in office, Harrison governed with focus and intensity. He believed strongly in the power of a strong federal government and was committed to modernizing the nation. Under his administration, America experienced a surge of legislative activity. The 51st Congress, which served during his term, became known as the Billion-Dollar Congress because, for the first time, federal spending passed $1 billion, an astonishing sum for the time. Harrison championed civil rights for African Americans in the South, pushing for legislation to protect their right to vote. Though the effort ultimately failed in the Senate, his advocacy marked a moment of courage, especially for a president from a northern state, in an era when civil rights were often politically inconvenient. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act into law in 1890, a landmark piece of legislation that aimed to curb the growing power of monopolies and promote fair competition, a sign that the government was beginning to grapple with the enormous influence of industrial giants. Harrison also oversaw the admission of 6 new states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, bringing a new shape to the growing American West. He invested in a modern navy and embraced the idea that America would one day play a larger role on the world stage. And while he lacked the magnetic appeal of more famous leaders, Harrison's presidency was marked by quiet strength and thoughtful governance. He was a man of order, principle, and deep religious faith. But as his term came to a close, he faced personal tragedy. His beloved wife, Caroline, fell seriously ill and died just weeks before the end of his presidency. Grieving and politically vulnerable, Harrison lost his bid for re-election in 1892 to the man he had previously unseated, Grover Cleveland, setting the stage for one of the most unique presidential rivalries in American history. As Benjamin Harrison left the White House in early 1893, he stepped away with quiet dignity, having guided the country through a time of rapid transformation. Though he had lost re-election to Grover Cleveland, Harrison remained proud of what had been accomplished during his single term. He had been a president who took his role seriously, believing that government existed to serve the people and that leadership required courage, even when it came at a political cost. After returning to private life in Indianapolis, Harrison resumed his law practice and continued to speak out on national issues. He stayed active in public discourse and was called upon to represent the United States in international matters, including serving as lead counsel for Venezuela in a border dispute with Great Britain, a role that showcased his legal skill and his belief in diplomacy. Despite his reputation for being reserved and somewhat aloof, those who knew Harrison described him as deeply thoughtful, kind, and generous in private. He lived a life grounded in faith and family, and after the death of his first wife, Caroline, he eventually remarried in 1896 to her niece, Mary Dimmock, a decision that caused some controversy, but brought companionship and happiness in his later years. Harrison continued to reflect on his time as president, and although he had not achieved all that he set out to do, particularly in the area of civil rights, he never wavered in his belief that government must protect its most vulnerable citizens. His support for African American voting rights, his commitment to civil service reform, and his effort to regulate the growing power of corporations were early signs of what would become central political struggles in the coming century. In a time when the United States was evolving from a rural, agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse, Harrison stood as a president who valued order, fairness, and moral responsibility. He believed in the power of law and the importance of an active federal government, not as an overreach, but as a necessary force for good in a rapidly modernizing society. Harrison passed away in 1901 at the age of 67, just months before his country would enter a new century. Though his presidency is often overshadowed by more dramatic figures, history has grown kinder to Benjamin Harrison. He governed during a pivotal time, planted the seeds of reform, and set standards that future presidents would build upon. His life reminds us that leadership is not always loud. It can also be quiet, deliberate, and deeply principled. At the turn of the 20th century, America was changing fast. Cities were booming, industries were rising, and the country was starting to look beyond its own borders. Into this moment stepped William McKinley, the 24th man to serve as president, and the one who would lead the United States into a new century. He was born in Niles, Ohio, in 1843, the seventh of 9 children in a working-class family. From an early age, McKinley was known for his gentle manner, strong moral compass, and sense of duty. During the Civil War, he enlisted in the Union Army and served with quiet bravery, eventually rising to the rank of major, a title he proudly carried for the rest of his life. After the war, McKinley studied law, entered politics, and quickly gained a reputation as a man of integrity and calm resolve. He served in Congress for over a decade, where he championed protective tariffs and conservative economic policies that aimed to support American industry. His speeches were not fiery or theatrical, but clear, measured, and persuasive, earning him deep respect and loyalty from voters in his home state and beyond. As governor of Ohio, he worked to improve labor conditions and education, balancing the needs of workers and business owners alike. In the presidential election of 1896, McKinley faced off against William Jennings Bryan, a charismatic populist who electrified crowds with his Cross of Gold speech and promises of free silver to support farmers and the working class. McKinley, with his campaign manager Mark Hanna, ran a tightly organized and well-funded campaign from his home in Canton, Ohio. While Bryan traveled the country by train, McKinley stayed in one place and let the people come to him. Thousands of visitors arrived to hear his calm and reassuring words. His message of economic stability and prosperity resonated with many Americans weary from depression and uncertainty. McKinley won decisively, becoming the 24th President of the United States. As president, McKinley presided over a period of recovery and growth. The economy began to improve, factories restarted, and employment rose. But his presidency would soon be shaped by events far beyond domestic policy. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain over its brutal rule in Cuba. Though McKinley had hoped to avoid war, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and growing pressure from Congress and the press made conflict inevitable. The Spanish-American War was brief but transformative. America emerged victorious, gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and asserting itself as a new world power. McKinley believed in the expansion of American influence, not through conquest, but through commerce, diplomacy, and moral leadership. He spoke of a benevolent assimilation in the Philippines, though the reality was far more complicated and violent than the phrase suggested. Still, at home, he remained a popular figure, seen as steady, kind, and devoted to the public good. He ran for re-election in 1900 and won easily, with the dynamic Theodore Roosevelt as his new vice president. But just months into his second term, tragedy struck. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. For a time, it seemed he might recover, but infection set in, and on September 14th, William McKinley died. Leaving the nation in shock and sorrow, his final words were, "It is God's way, His will be done." William McKinley was a man of quiet strength and unshakable faith, who guided America through a time of great change and left it stronger, more united, and poised to take its place on the world stage. William McKinley's second term as president began with great hope. He had led the nation through war and economic recovery, and Americans trusted him to guide them into a new century of progress. The election of 1900 had been a resounding affirmation of his leadership. With Theodore Roosevelt now serving as his vice president, McKinley set out to further solidify America's global presence and promote peace and prosperity at home. He was not a flashy man. He was reserved, often soft-spoken, and deeply religious. His personal life was marked by sorrow, especially the illness of his beloved wife Ida, who had lost both of their young daughters and suffered from fragile health. Yet McKinley remained a devoted husband, often seen gently holding Ida's hand or rearranging his schedule so she would not be alone. During his second term, McKinley turned his attention to trade and diplomacy. He believed that America's future lay not just in its borders, but in its ability to connect with the world through commerce. He spoke of open doors in China, advocating for equal trading rights and the protection of Chinese territorial integrity at a time when powerful nations were carving it up for themselves. Though his foreign policy was shaped by economic ambition, McKinley also emphasized American responsibility to lead by example, not domination. It was a delicate balance and not one easily achieved, especially in the Philippines, where American forces faced a bloody insurgency following the war with Spain. McKinley struggled with this contradiction, but he remained convinced that American presence could bring stability and opportunity. At home, the country was enjoying a period of growth. New technologies, such as the telephone and electric lighting, were transforming everyday life. Industry was booming, and the sense of national pride was swelling. McKinley traveled widely, the first president to do so by train during peacetime, to such an extent he wanted to meet the people, to understand their needs and dreams firsthand. His final trip was to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a great showcase of modern invention and cooperation among the nations of the Americas. On September 5, 1901, he gave a speech there about peace and trade, about lifting barriers and building partnerships. It would be his last. The next day, while greeting visitors in the Temple of Music, McKinley stood smiling, extending his hand to a long line of well-wishers. From the crowd stepped Leon Zolgus, a disillusioned anarchist who had hidden a revolver under a handkerchief. He shot the president twice in the chest. At first, McKinley remained calm, even instructing those around him not to harm his attacker. Doctors believed the wounds were not fatal, and for several days McKinley appeared to be recovering, but infection spread silently. On the night of September 13th, he whispered a hymn he and Ida had loved, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." He died in the early morning hours of September 14th at the age of 58. The nation mourned deeply. Cities fell silent, flags flew at half-staff, and tens of thousands lined the tracks as McKinley's funeral train passed through towns and fields. He was buried in Canton, Ohio, beside the wife he had loved so dearly. Though he was succeeded by the vibrant and energetic Theodore Roosevelt, many Americans remembered McKinley as the last link to a gentler era, a man of honor, dignity, and unwavering duty. His presidency marked a turning point, the beginning of America's role as a world power, but he himself had always believed that power should be used with care, guided by principles and compassion. As you close your eyes tonight, think of the quiet president who held his wife's hand through sorrow, who believed in peace even after war, and who led not with force or noise, but with calm courage and steadfast heart. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just become president, he charged into history like a man on a mission, full of energy, conviction, and the kind of personality that filled every room he entered. Born in New York City in October 1858, Teddy, as he was known even then, was a sickly child plagued by asthma and poor health. But from a young age, he was determined to make himself strong. He exercised relentlessly, boxed, rode horses, climbed mountains, and built up a will as powerful as his body. He once said, "I never would have been president if it had not been for my asthma," and in a strange way it was true. His need to overcome hardship shaped his fearless spirit. He grew into a brilliant student, graduated from Harvard, and dove into public service with a passion for reform. He served as a New York State Assemblyman, police commissioner, and assistant secretary of the Navy. But it was the Spanish-American War that made him a national hero. He led a volunteer cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in Cuba in 1898, and America loved him for it. Soon after, he became governor of New York, then vice president under William McKinley. But in September 1901, tragedy struck. McKinley was assassinated, and at just 42, Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. He brought with him a whirlwind of ideas, energy, and fearless leadership. He believed the government should be strong enough to stand up to big business and protect ordinary people. He took on powerful corporations, broke up monopolies, and passed the Pure Food and Drug Act to make sure what people ate and drank was safe. He also loved nature deeply and worked tirelessly to preserve it, creating national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges that millions still enjoy today. He called it the Square Deal, and he meant it. Fairness for workers, consumers, and businesses alike. When Theodore Roosevelt stepped into his first full term after winning the election in 1904, he did so with the confidence of a man who had already proven himself. His energy was unmatched. He worked from early in the morning until late at night, reading constantly, writing books, giving speeches, and meeting with advisors. He believed the presidency was a bully pulpit, a powerful platform to inspire the American people and push for big changes. One of his proudest achievements was transforming the role of government from a passive observer into an active force for good. He used federal power to regulate businesses, protect consumers, and ensure fair competition. He filed dozens of lawsuits against monopolies, which he called trusts, earning the nickname Trust Buster. Roosevelt also turned his focus outward onto the world stage. He believed in peace, but also believed that America should be strong and ready to defend its interests. "Speak softly and carry a big stick," he often said, and it became the slogan of his foreign policy. He helped mediate peace in the Russo-Japanese War, earning the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to receive one. He also pushed for the construction of the Panama Canal, a colossal engineering feat that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and transformed global trade. It was a symbol of Roosevelt's bold vision, huge, ambitious, and world-changing. But beneath his toughness was a deep love of nature. He had explored the Badlands, hunted in the Dakotas, and once gave a 90-minute speech after being shot, refusing to stop until he was done. Yet what truly moved him was America's wilderness. As president, he protected over 200 million acres of national forests, parks, and reserves. He believed future generations should enjoy the same wild lands he had loved, and he laid the foundation for the modern conservation. By the time he left office in 1909, Roosevelt had changed the presidency forever. He was not just a politician, he was a symbol of action, reform, and progress. He had expanded the power of the office, uplifted the people, challenged the status quo, and showed that leadership could be bold, moral, and relentless. Even after stepping down, he remained a major political force, running again in 1912 under the Progressive Party, famously splitting the vote and helping Woodrow Wilson win. Though he lost that race, his impact never faded. As you drift to sleep now, imagine the sound of hoofbeats echoing through a pine forest, the roar of waterfalls in a vast national park, and the determined voice of a man who believed in courage, in doing what was right, and in living every moment with purpose. That was Theodore Roosevelt, America's cowboy, crusader, and champion of the people. In the quiet autumn of 1857, in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, a baby boy named William Howard Taft was born into a family of prestige and ambition. His father had served as Attorney General and Secretary of War, and from a young age, Taft was surrounded by the principles of duty, law, and public service. He wasn't fiery or flashy like some of his peers. He was careful, thoughtful, and driven by a deep respect for the rule of law. He loved books, especially legal ones, and studied hard, graduating second in his class at Yale. His dream was not to be a politician, but a judge. a quiet life devoted to justice. But fate had other plans. Through a series of appointments and successes, Taft climbed the ranks of public life. He served as a judge, then as governor of the Philippines, and later as Secretary of War under Theodore Roosevelt. He was loyal, capable, and humble, and Roosevelt, confident in his protege, supported him as his successor in the election of 1908. Taft won easily and stepped into the White House with the blessing of his predecessor and friend. But almost from the beginning, Taft struggled under the weight of the presidency. He was a man of reason in a time that demanded boldness. Where Roosevelt had thrived on confrontation and change, Taft preferred compromise and procedure. The people who had adored Roosevelt now found Taft too cautious, too slow. Still, Taft accomplished much during his 4 years. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, expanded the civil service, improved the postal system, and pursued more antitrust lawsuits than Roosevelt had. He reorganized the State Department and began efforts to modernize the federal court system. His policies were often practical and thoughtful, but lacked the charisma that captured the public imagination. Even worse, he found himself at odds with Roosevelt, who grew disillusioned with his former friend's leadership. Their falling out would lead to a dramatic and bitter political battle in the years to come. And yet, through it all, Taft remained grounded. He believed in the system, in fairness, in the law above politics. Though his presidency was marked by frustration and division, he never wavered from his principles. He didn't crave attention or adoration. He simply wanted to serve. After the bitter election of 1912, William Howard Taft found himself defeated and deeply wounded. His old friend turned rival, Theodore Roosevelt, had split the Republican vote by running under the Progressive Party, and the result was a decisive victory for Democrat Woodrow Wilson. It was a bruising end to a presidency marked by tension and disappointment. But Taft, ever composed and dignified, accepted the outcome with grace. He returned to Yale, where he began teaching law, delighted to be back in an academic setting, surrounded by books, ideas, and young minds eager to learn. Public life had worn him down, but the classroom restored him. For Taft, the presidency had never been the pinnacle of ambition. His true dream from the earliest days of his career had always been the Supreme Court. He believed deeply in the Constitution, in order, in fairness, and in the calm deliberation of justice. And in 1921, nearly a decade after he left the White House, that dream finally came true. President Warren G. Harding nominated him as Chief Justice of the United States, a position Taft accepted with joy and gratitude. To this day, he remains the only person in American history to have served both as president and as Chief Justice. As head of the nation's highest court, Taft found his calling. He reorganized the judiciary, improved the administration of the courts, and worked to make the legal system more efficient. He presided with quiet authority, always focused on clarity, logic, and the steady application of the law. It was here, in the hushed halls of the Supreme Court, that Taft truly thrived. He wasn't a bold reformer or a dramatic dissenter. He was a craftsman of reason, shaping the court into a more modern and disciplined institution. His passion for justice was unwavering, and his legacy in the judiciary endures long past his term. In his later years, Taft's health declined, and by the time he retired in 1930, he was exhausted. Just a few weeks after stepping down, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the first president to rest there, and one of only 2 ever to be honored with that distinction. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and the day fades behind you, imagine the quiet corridors of the Supreme Court at dusk, the shuffle of papers, and the soft murmur of wise counsel echoing through chambers lined with oak and marble. Think of Taft there, at peace, doing the work he had always wanted to do, not with applause, not with spectacle, but with integrity and humility. William Howard Taft reminds us that greatness isn't always found in glory. It's often found in staying true to who you are. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in the town of Staunton, Virginia, in the year 1856. He grew up during the painful years of the American Civil War. His father, a Presbyterian minister who supported the Confederacy, and the memories of that fractured nation would leave a lasting impression on young Wilson. He was a thoughtful child, introspective and studious, often struggling with reading due to what we now believe was dyslexia. But he was determined and fiercely intelligent. Over time, he developed a deep love for learning, especially history, politics, and law. He went on to study at Princeton University, earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, and later a doctorate in political science from Johns Hopkins University, making him the only U.S. president to hold a Ph.D. Wilson spent many years in academia, eventually becoming the president of Princeton University. He was a reformer, someone who believed deeply in moral progress, in shaping young minds, and in using education to create a better society. His passion for ideas and governance led him into politics, and in 1910 he became the governor of New Jersey. There he quickly made a name for himself as a progressive leader, committed to fighting corruption and pushing for reforms that would benefit ordinary people. In 1912, with the Republican Party split between William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, the Democratic nominee, won the presidency. He entered the White House with a clear agenda to reshape American government and bring moral purpose to national politics. He called his platform the New Freedom, a set of policies aimed at dismantling monopolies, reforming banking, lowering tariffs, and strengthening protections for workers and consumers. Under Wilson's leadership, the Federal Reserve System was established in 1913, creating a more stable and flexible financial system. He also signed the Clayton Antitrust Act into law, which aimed to curb unfair business practices and protect labor unions. Wilson was not a man of great charisma, but he was persuasive, principled, and tireless. He believed in strong leadership, guided by a sense of righteousness and deep conviction, yet his idealism sometimes made him rigid and unwilling to compromise, and his vision of progress often clashed with political reality. Still, he pressed forward, determined to reshape the country in the image of justice and order. But the world was changing rapidly. Across the Atlantic, war erupted in Europe in 1914, and the United States, under Wilson's leadership, tried to remain neutral. For years, he resisted calls for American intervention, even as German submarines sank civilian ships and alliances pulled more countries into the growing conflict. Wilson won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But within months, the tide turned. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and tried to forge a secret alliance with Mexico against the U.S., Wilson could no longer hold the country back. In April of 1917, he asked Congress to declare war to make the world safe for democracy. When the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson faced a challenge unlike any president before him. This was not just a battle of armies. It was a test of national unity, of production, of morale, and of principle. Wilson moved swiftly, organizing the Selective Service to draft soldiers, overseeing the transformation of industries for war production, and asking the American people to contribute through food rationing, Liberty bonds, and shared sacrifice. More than 2 million Americans would cross the Atlantic, and by the war's end, in November of 1918, the presence of fresh American troops had helped to tip the scales and bring the bloody conflict to a close. But Wilson saw beyond the battlefield. In January of 1918, while the war still raged, he gave a speech outlining his vision for the post-war world. It was a bold and idealistic plan known as the 14 Points. a roadmap to peace rooted in open diplomacy, free trade, the reduction of arms, self-determination for nations, where countries could resolve disputes without war. When the fighting stopped, Wilson sailed to Europe to represent the United States at the Paris Peace Conference, the first time a sitting U.S. president had traveled overseas while in office. In Paris, he was treated like a hero. Crowds cheered in the streets, seeing in him the hope for a new and just world order. But diplomacy was hard. The Allied leaders, France's Georges Clemenceau, Britain's David Lloyd George, and Italy's Vittorio Orlando, had their own goals: punishment for Germany, reparations, and territorial gains. Wilson had to compromise. The Treaty of Versailles that emerged from the conference did include his prized League of Nations, but it also placed harsh penalties on Germany, something Wilson had tried to avoid. Back home, the treaty faced fierce opposition. Many in the Senate, especially Republican critics, feared that joining the League would drag the United States into future wars without the consent of Congress. Wilson, refusing to alter the treaty, took his case directly to the people. He embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour, hoping to rally public support. But the strain was too much. In September of 1919, while traveling through Colorado, Wilson collapsed. Days later, he suffered a massive stroke. For the rest of his presidency, Wilson was a shadow of his former self. Half paralyzed and weakened, he remained in the White House, largely hidden from public view. His wife, Edith Wilson, became his gatekeeper, controlling access and shielding him from political stress. Some historians call her the first female president in practice. Meanwhile, the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States never joined the League of Nations, one of the greatest disappointments of Wilson's life. He left office in March of 1921, a broken man in many ways, his body weakened, his dreams for global peace unrealized. He lived quietly in Washington, D.C. until his death in February of 1924, and yet the legacy of Woodrow Wilson endures. He was a complex man, brilliant, visionary, stubborn, and deeply flawed. He advanced progressive reforms at home but held regressive views on race, resegregating federal offices and dismissing the rising voices of Black Americans. He shaped modern American foreign policy with a belief that America could be a moral leader in the world, even as his own health and inflexibility undermined that vision. His League of Nations would eventually inspire the creation of the United Nations, and his bold ideas about self-determination and international cooperation changed the way the world imagined peace. As you drift into sleep, imagine a world once torn apart by war, where one man stood in the halls of power and tried to speak for justice, order, and lasting peace. Wilson's voice may have faded, but the echo of his dreams still lingers in the pages of history. In the spring of 1920, as the world reeled from the aftermath of the Great War and America tried to find its footing again, a calm and confident voice rose above the uncertainty. That voice belonged to Warren Gamaliel Harding, a senator from Ohio, who promised something the nation desperately craved: a return to normalcy. The word itself was simple, perhaps even awkward, but it resonated with millions. Americans were tired. Tired of war, tired of turmoil, tired of progressive reforms that seemed to stretch society too thin. Harding offered comfort, stability, and the sense that things could go back to the way they once were. He was born in 1865 in a small town called Blooming Grove, Ohio. As a young man, Harding bought a struggling newspaper, the Marion Daily Star, and turned it into a successful publication. His calm demeanor and affable charm made him well-liked, and his marriage to Florence Kling DeWolf, a strong-willed and politically savvy woman, helped drive his ambitions. Harding entered politics, served in the Ohio State Senate, and eventually became a U.S. Senator in 1914. Though not a fiery legislator, he was known for his pleasant nature and his ability to get along with everyone. When he ran for president in 1920, Harding was seen as a safe and steady choice, someone who wouldn't rock the boat. He won the Republican nomination in a dramatic convention deadlock, emerging as a compromise candidate. His campaign, run largely from his front porch in Marion, welcomed thousands of visitors. He spoke in broad, reassuring terms, avoiding specifics and embracing the nation's yearning for peace and prosperity. And it worked. In November of 1920, Harding won one of the largest landslides in American history, defeating Democrat James Cox and his running mate, a young Franklin D. Roosevelt. Harding carried 37 of the 48 states, and with him came the promise that the chaos of the past would give way to a gentler, quieter era. But behind the calm surface, storm clouds were gathering. Harding filled his cabinet with a mix of capable reformers and corrupt cronies. Some appointments, like Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State and Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, brought real strength to the administration. Others, like Albert Fall and Harry Doherty, would become symbols of scandal and betrayal. When Warren G. Harding entered the White House in March of 1921, the nation was full of hope. His calm presence and plain-spoken manner had soothed a weary public, and his promise of a return to normalcy felt like a comforting blanket after the cold storm of war. At first, there were signs of genuine progress. Harding called a conference on naval disarmament that led to real agreements between the world's major powers. He supported civil rights for African Americans, at least in word if not in force, and he pushed for economic reforms that would stabilize the post-war economy. But beneath the surface, things were unraveling. Harding had a fatal flaw. He trusted the wrong people. His administration included men he referred to as the Ohio Gang, friends and political allies from back home who were more interested in enriching themselves than in serving the country. While Harding gave speeches about honesty and duty, some of his closest advisors were busy making shady deals behind closed doors. The worst of these would erupt into what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, one of the most notorious corruption cases in American history. It involved the secret leasing of federal oil reserves in Wyoming and California to private companies in exchange for bribes. The man at the center of it, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, became the first former cabinet official to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. Harding himself was not directly tied to the scandal, and many historians believe he was more naive than malicious. He had hoped to be a president of healing, someone who brought the country back together. But the burden of leadership, the betrayal of his friends, and the weight of the office seemed to press down on him. In the summer of 1923, Harding set out on a cross-country trip he called the Voyage of Understanding. He wanted to connect with the American people, to see the West and speak to citizens far from Washington. He visited Alaska, becoming the first sitting president to do so, and made plans to visit California next. But the journey took a toll on his health. While staying at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, Harding fell ill. On the evening of August 2, 1923, he suddenly died, most likely of a heart attack. He was just 57 years old. His sudden death shocked the nation. Millions mourned, and his body was returned to Washington in a solemn train procession. At first, Harding was remembered with great affection. But as investigations into his administration deepened, his reputation began to suffer. The Teapot Dome scandal and others stained his legacy, and by the end of the decade, he was often listed among the worst presidents in history. Yet Harding was not without his virtues. He loved his country deeply, cared for his friends, even when they did not deserve it, and longed to bring peace after a time of chaos. He was a man of his era, flawed and human, trying to steady the ship of state as best he could. And in the quiet hours of the night, as the world shifted toward modernity, he stood at the edge of the old and the new, hoping to leave behind calm waters. Now, as you drift deeper into sleep, picture the soft flicker of gaslight in a hotel room by the bay, the muted whispers of a president lost too soon, and the lingering question of what might have been if trust had been placed more wisely. There was a quiet strength in Calvin Coolidge, a calmness that felt like granite beneath the noise of the modern world. Born on the 4th of July in 1872 in the small town of Plymouth Notch, Vermont, Coolidge came into the world surrounded by mountains, simplicity, and a deep sense of duty. His upbringing was modest. His father was a seriousness beyond his years and a local official, but from a young age, Coolidge showed a seriousness beyond his years. He rarely spoke without purpose, and he came to be known for his stillness, his restraint, and his unwavering belief in the value of personal responsibility. Coolidge studied law and eventually entered politics in Massachusetts, where he rose steadily through the ranks. He served as a city councilman, then mayor, then state senator, then lieutenant governor, and finally governor. His big moment came in 1919 during the Boston police strike. When striking officers walked off the job, leaving the city in chaos, Coolidge called in the National Guard and refused to rehire the strikers. His response was firm, measured, and deeply popular with the public. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime, he said. The phrase became famous, and Coolidge was launched into the national spotlight. He became vice president under Warren G. Harding in 1921, and when Harding died suddenly in August of 1923, Coolidge was visiting his family in Vermont. In the middle of the night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, his father, who was a notary public, administered the presidential oath of office. It was a moment that felt both surreal and deeply rooted in American tradition. Coolidge, ever steady, took the helm without fanfare. As president, Coolidge governed with a belief that the best government was one that interfered as little as possible. He slashed taxes, reduced the federal budget, and supported business growth. "The business of America is business," he once said, a phrase that captured his philosophy. The economy boomed during his presidency, so much so that the decade became known as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz music played, cities grew, radios crackled to life in homes across the nation, and for many Americans the future seemed bright. But Coolidge was not a man swept up in excitement. Even as the country danced toward modernity, he remained rooted in quiet values. He read his Bible each day, walked to church on Sundays, and spent long hours in thought. His style was minimalist. He avoided unnecessary words and rarely sought attention. Reporters often joked that he could be silent in 5 different languages. And yet, when he did speak, his words carried weight. His presidency was largely free of scandal, and he earned respect for restoring integrity to the White House after the chaos of the Harding years. He believed in thrift, honesty, and restraint, not just in government, but in life. He declined to run for a second full term in 1928, famously writing on a small piece of paper, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928, and with that he stepped away. Calvin Coolidge's quiet nature often made him a figure of curiosity, and while his presidency was marked by limited government intervention, it was also a time of great transformation in the American economy. When he stepped into office, the country had just emerged from the horrors of World War I and was searching for stability. Coolidge believed that the best way to restore that stability was through economic freedom. His philosophy was simple: leave the people to their own devices and the nation would thrive. In the years under his leadership, the U.S. experienced an unprecedented period of economic prosperity. The stock market soared, industries boomed, and consumer goods flooded the market. Coolidge's administration focused on reducing the national debt, cutting taxes, and deregulating industries. He had faith in the ability of the American people to drive their own success, and he sought to remove barriers to their ambitions. These actions earned him the approval of many business leaders who admired his pro-business stance. But despite the outward prosperity, there were growing signs of trouble beneath the surface. The stock market was soaring, but much of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. While the rich enjoyed the boom, many ordinary Americans struggled with wages that didn't keep pace with rising costs. The disparity between the rich and the poor widened, and by the end of Coolidge's term, there were warning signs that not all was well. Coolidge, however, remained confident. He believed that the natural order of things would correct itself and that the government should stay out of the way. "The chief business of the American people is business," he famously stated, reinforcing his view that government should not meddle in the economic affairs of the nation. His hands-off approach earned him admiration from business circles, but left him blind to the speculative practices that would later contribute to the Great Depression. Another aspect of Coolidge's presidency that remained significant was his approach to civil rights. Though he did take steps to address racial injustice, his actions were often seen as too cautious. He supported anti-lynching legislation, though it never passed through Congress, and he spoke out against the Ku Klux Klan, calling them un-American and denouncing their violent tactics. Yet, many felt his efforts were more symbolic than substantial, as he refrained from pushing aggressively for racial equality or reform during his time in office. Despite these complexities, Coolidge's time in the White House is often remembered for the calm and stability he brought during a tumultuous time. He had a remarkable ability to stay out of the spotlight while still influencing the course of history. He didn't seek glory, and he didn't chase headlines. Instead, he governed with a quiet authority that many admired, even if they didn't fully understand him. When Coolidge left the White House in 1929, he faded from public life. He retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he continued to live quietly until his death in 1933. Coolidge's legacy, like his presidency, is a study in contradictions. He presided over one of the most prosperous periods in American history, but his lack of foresight about the economic dangers to come left him with a mixed legacy. He believed in individualism, and perhaps that belief blinded him to the interconnectedness of a society that was rapidly changing. In the quiet moments of the night, as the sound of a distant clock ticks softly in the background, you can imagine Coolidge walking through the fields of Vermont, the sun setting behind the mountains, his steady steps echoing in the silence. He may have been a man of few words, but in his stillness, he shaped the course of a nation's future. And sometimes, in the deepest moments of reflection, the silence speaks volumes.